Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
Let me set the scene. It was a Wednesday, one of those bland, middle of the week evenings that hardly registers as important in most people's lives. For me, though, it was supposed to be different. It was my wedding anniversary, 10 years married to Ben, a man who, despite all his flaws, always managed to make me feel like I was worth noticing. I'd marked the day on every calendar I could find. Our fridge, my phone, even the group chat with my parents. Partly as a joke, but mostly because I knew, in my bones, they'd forget. The same way they'd forgotten last year and the year before, and pretty much every other year that didn't include a major hospital stay or a car accident. Still, part of me hoped maybe this time they'd remember. Ben came home late, arms full of cheap grocery store flowers, the kind that smell faintly of Lysol, and come wrapped in so much plastic it's a miracle any of the petals survived the trip. He took one look at my face, sat down at the kitchen table, and grinned in that way he does when he knows I'm trying too hard not to care. "Well," he said, "at least I remembered." And that's when it hit me. Not just the lack of a call or a card from my parents, but the fact that I was sitting in my own kitchen, eating leftover sesame chicken from the fridge, trying to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. I refreshed my phone every 10 minutes, hoping for a message, something small, even a happy anniversary meme. Hell, even a thumbs up reaction in the group chat. Nothing. Not a blip, not a notification, not even one of those accidental butt dials my mom's so good at sending when she's fumbling through her oversized purse for her glasses. There was only silence, broken by Ben's attempts at small talk, which I mostly ignored, staring out the window into the darkness, the glow of streetlights flickering off puddles in the driveway. The next morning, while I was trying to work up the energy to care about emails and spreadsheets, my phone lit up with a dozen notifications. At first, I thought maybe finally my parents had remembered. Maybe I was being paranoid and they just wanted to surprise me with something. But it wasn't about me. It was never about me. It was about my younger sister, Melissa, the star, the chosen one, the family's personal project. Instagram, Facebook, even a mass email blast my dad apparently figured out how to send. All showing off the huge party they'd thrown the night before. Not for an engagement, not for a birthday, but for Melissa landing a new job at some tech startup she'd only applied to 2 weeks earlier. Balloons, banners, cupcakes with her name piped on in blue and gold. Neighbors in matching t-shirts with Team Melissa printed across the chest. Even the family dog had a party hat. It was, without exaggeration, the kind of party they hadn't bothered to throw for my college graduation, my wedding, or the birth of my own daughter, all of which apparently paled in comparison to the thrilling news that Melissa would now be working from home in sweatpants for slightly more money than she made before. If I sound bitter, it's because I am, but I'm also tired of playing the good sport, tired of telling myself it doesn't matter, tired of swallowing that little shard of jealousy and pretending it's just indigestion. Ben, watching the story unfold on his phone, tried to make a joke about how at least we wouldn't have to clean up after a party. But his voice was hollow, and I could see he was angry on my behalf, in a way that made me love him and resent my parents even more. Now, here's the part where I want to stop and ask you, seriously, what would you do in my place? How many times does your family get to forget you before you start wondering if it's all in your head? Is it petty to want what your sister gets without having to grovel for it? I keep asking myself these questions, but I never find answers that feel right. So if you've ever been the one left out, the one who gets the "oh sorry we forgot" text while everyone else is popping champagne, I want to know, would you keep letting it go, or would you finally do something about it? Back to my story. That morning, I texted my parents. Nothing dramatic, just a screenshot of their smiling faces at Melissa's party with a quick, "Glad to see you all had a good time last night. Ben and I celebrated too, quietly." My mother replied within 5 minutes. "Oh, you know we love you both equally. Melissa's just had a hard year. We wanted to do something nice for her. You understand." It was always the same line, some version of "she needs more support." as if I'd ever been the one to demand more attention or act out in ways that made everyone drop what they were doing to comfort me. I wish I could say I let it go, but something inside me snapped, not in a dramatic, screaming fit kind of way, but more like the slow tearing of fabric that's been stretched too thin for too long. I did something I hadn't done before. I took that photo of my parents and Melissa, all grins and matching shirts, and forwarded it to every member of the extended family group chat, including the cousins, the aunts, the uncle in Arizona, who barely remembers my name. I added a note: "Nice to see the family still has energy for celebrations. Maybe next time we'll get a party for paying off the car loan." The reactions came fast, mostly emojis and polite laughter, but I could feel the discomfort ripple out through the digital grapevine. Within the hour, my mother was calling me, her voice sharper than usual, her words tumbling over each other in that breathless way she has when she's not actually sorry, just pissed that someone called her out. She didn't apologize, of course. She didn't even ask how my anniversary went. She wanted to know why I was making drama in front of the whole family, why I couldn't just let things be, why I always had to stir the pot. I let her talk, said almost nothing, and hung up before the conversation could go where it always goes. Her crying, me feeling guilty, the world spinning on like nothing happened. But this time, I didn't feel guilty. I felt awake, for the first time in years. And that's when I started planning what came next. Not just a petty revenge, but a reckoning for every forgotten moment, every missed celebration, every time I'd been told to grow up or be the bigger person. If my family wanted drama, I decided maybe it was time to show them just how much I'd learned from watching them all these years. I didn't know it yet, but crossing that line, taking my pain public, even in a small way, was the start of something I couldn't walk back from, even if I'd wanted to. And the fallout, as you'll see, was just getting started. If I had $1 for every time someone in my family told me I was the responsible one, I'd have retired at 35 and bought a place far enough away that the word sibling rivalry would sound like a foreign language, something you hear about on daytime TV but never experience firsthand. The problem with being the responsible one, the one who doesn't make waves, the one who remembers birthdays and handles emergencies and never calls home in the middle of the night crying about rent, is that after a while, everyone just expects you to keep absorbing blows that would drop anyone else to the floor. I was never coddled the way Melissa was, never given the benefit of the doubt, never granted that soft space to land when life got hard. Instead, I was handed a bucket, told to clean up after everyone else's mess, and then applauded for being so level-headed and mature, as if any of it was a choice, and not just the survival mechanism of a kid who figured out early that crying got you nothing but a headache. Growing up in our house was a lesson in contradictions and hierarchy so subtle you'd miss them if you blinked. The kind of patterns that reveal themselves only after you've had enough distance to see your childhood for the exercise in managed disappointment it really was. Melissa, 2 years younger but always 1,000 miles ahead in our parents' estimation, moved through life like a star athlete on a field built just for her, each obstacle cleared by someone else before she ever had to face it herself. My earliest memories are peppered with images of her twirling around in brand new shoes, always a size too big, so she could grow into them, while I made do with whatever pair I'd finally outgrown enough for my mom to stop arguing that they'll last one more season. Every birthday, every milestone, every scrape and sniffle became an occasion for our parents to gather around Melissa like she was a tiny, delicate sun, and we were all supposed to orbit around her, grateful for the warmth she deigned to give. I learned to celebrate myself in private, little victories no one else noticed or cared about. And sometimes, in the dark, I'd imagine a version of our family where the scales were balanced, where my achievements weren't met with a shrug or worse, a thin smile and a quick change of subject to something Melissa had done years earlier. There was my college graduation, an event my parents couldn't be bothered to fly in for, citing the cost and the hassle, promising they'd make it up to me later, a promise that, like so many others, drifted away and was never mentioned again. Contrast that with Melissa's ballet recital. one she quit practicing for halfway through the season, only to beg for a second chance when she realized everyone else would be watching, where our parents sat in the front row, eyes shining, camcorder rolling, roses clutched in nervous hands, as if she was about to pirouette onto the stage at Lincoln Center instead of the high school gymnasium. Years of this left grooves in my soul, tracks that guided me straight to adulthood, where the script never changed, only the stakes got higher. I moved out at 22, started my own life, built a career from the ground up, while Melissa floated from crisis to crisis, each one followed by a bailout or a fresh start. My parents always there with open arms and open wallets. I stopped expecting fairness and learned to find satisfaction in the small spaces they forgot to occupy, in the moments that were mine alone. Quiet holidays with Ben, late night drives, my daughter's first steps witnessed only by us, not broadcast to the family chat, because, frankly, I didn't want the applause if it came only because Melissa had nothing better to offer that day. But even as I built walls, the need for validation, the hope that someday things might change, never really left. Maybe that's why, after the anniversary fiasco and the party for Melissa's new job, something inside me wouldn't let it go. I tried to talk to my dad about it, thinking maybe he'd see reason, maybe if I just laid it out plainly he'd recognize the pattern. He shrugged, an old tired motion that said more than words ever could. "You're tougher than your sister, Amanda. Melissa needs more support. She's always had a harder time." He said this like it was a settled fact, as though my own struggles were some theoretical exercise, not real things that happen to real people. That night, I started collecting my own kind of ammunition. I dug through old boxes, pulled out birthday cards, some signed "Love, Mom and Dad," others simply "Mom." The difference barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but oh how I was looking. I scrolled back through group chats, found old photos from events I'd organized where half the faces were missing, including my parents. Their absence explained away with "something came up" or "you know how your mother is." I made a private folder, screenshots and scans, little reminders that I wasn't imagining things, that the imbalance was real as the ache in my chest every time Melissa's triumphs were paraded around like family treasure and mine were brushed aside. But I didn't just seethe in silence. If there's one thing you learn after years of being overlooked, it's how to strike back in ways that look innocent to everyone but the target. I started playing my own little game, dropping barbed compliments into conversations with Melissa. "I'm so proud of you for keeping a job for more than a year," I'd say. Or, "It's amazing how quickly you bounce back every time things fall apart." She'd laugh, but I could see the flicker of annoyance in her eyes, the way her smile tightened just a fraction. It was petty, sure, but it felt good in a way nothing else had for years. Then, as Melissa's job celebration reached its fever pitch, I decided to up the ante. I remembered a box of old home videos, one in particular of Melissa throwing a tantrum at her 7th birthday. Cake on the walls, presents flung across the room. My mother's voice in the background pleading with her to calm down while I sat quietly at the table, waiting for someone to notice I hadn't had a piece yet. On a whim, I digitized the video and posted it to Facebook, tagging Melissa and my parents with a caption that read, "Classic Melissa always knew how to make an entrance." Within minutes, the post exploded, family and friends chiming in with memories, laughter, a few gentle digs at Melissa's expense. For the first time, the attention was on me, even if only as the instigator, and I felt a thrill of vindication, a twisted sort of joy at seeing my sister squirm in the spotlight she usually craved. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Melissa called me within the hour, her voice tight and brittle, barely concealing the fury simmering beneath her usual calm. "Take it down, Amanda," she hissed. "It's not funny. You're just jealous. Why can't you ever be happy for me?" I almost laughed at the irony, her accusing me of jealousy, as if the uneven scales between us were my doing and not the result of years of parental favoritism. Before I could answer, our mother was on the phone too, her voice trembling with anger and embarrassment. "This isn't like you, Amanda. Take the video down now, or I swear I'll cut you off. We don't need this kind of drama in our family." I told her I'd think about it, which in parent speak is code for, I'll do what I want, and you'll deal with it. For the rest of the day, the group chats buzzed with speculation, cousins weighing in, aunts and uncles taking sides, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt dangerous, unpredictable, like maybe the responsible one wasn't the pushover everyone assumed. As the notifications piled up, I realized I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, a line I'd drawn myself and dared anyone to step over. And if my family wanted to make me the villain, I figured I'd play the role with style. By the time the dust settled, my mother had called me a dozen more times, each message more frantic than the last. But I didn't answer. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine, watched the video one more time, and smiled. Not because I enjoyed hurting them, but because for once, I was the one calling the shots. The next move was theirs, and I couldn't wait to see what they'd do. It's a strange sensation weighing the cost of cutting off your own family. Not in the figurative sense, not in the way people threaten to block each other after a heated Thanksgiving argument, but in the real heavy way that means you are choosing, eyes wide open, to redraw the lines of your own life and leave your parents on the other side of them. I spent most of that week oscillating between rage and a kind of hollow exhaustion, a tiredness that seeped into my bones every time another message from my mother lit up my phone, each one more manipulative than the last, each one dripping with that old familiar blend of guilt and disappointment that always seemed to push my buttons just so. I wasn't naive enough to think there wouldn't be fallout. I just hadn't realized how much the decision would bleed into every corner of my life, staining even the parts I'd fought so hard to keep for myself. Ben, for his part, tried to be Switzerland, neutral, calm, more interested in diffusing the tension than in taking sides, which only made me angrier because it felt like yet another person in my life refusing to acknowledge the depth of what I was feeling. He'd sit at the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone, telling me that families fight, that this would blow over like it always did, that I'd regret it if I said something I couldn't take back. Maybe he was right, I thought, but then I'd remember every time I'd bitten my tongue, every moment I'd swallowed my pride for the sake of keeping the peace, and I'd realize I was done carrying the burden alone. By the fourth day, I was done answering calls, done engaging with the endless back and forth in the group chat, done pretending that this was all just a misunderstanding that would pass, if only I'd apologize or laugh it off. I wanted something more permanent, something that would send a message even my parents couldn't ignore. So I sat down at my computer and composed a single clinical group message. No flowery language, no emotion, just the truth, as plainly as I could put it. I'm done pretending. I'm out. Don't contact me until you remember how to treat people. I read it over 3 times, searching for any cracks in my resolve, any hint that I'd let my emotions bleed onto the screen, but there was nothing. It was the most honest thing I'd written in years. I hit send, closed my laptop, and waited for the silence to settle, but the silence didn't come, not in the way I'd hoped. Instead, the response was swift, fractured, and ugly in its unpredictability. Some of my relatives, cousins who'd always felt like second-string players in the family drama, a couple of aunts who never quite fit in, reached out privately, offering words of support, quietly confessing that they'd seen the same patterns for years, but never felt brave enough to say so. Others came after me with a fury I hadn't expected, calling me dramatic and selfish, accusing me of tearing the family apart over what they insisted was just a misunderstanding. My mother, predictably, sent a long email, the kind that stretches on for pages, each paragraph more guilt-laden than the last, painting herself as the victim, wringing her hands over my father's supposed heartbreak, as if the real tragedy here was my refusal to keep pretending everything was fine. It's amazing how quickly a family can weaponize love, how those same hands that once held you when you were sick can turn into fists when you stop playing your assigned role. My parents didn't beg me to stay. They demanded that I return, as though my absence was a personal affront, a stain on their reputation that needed to be scrubbed out before anyone else noticed. The next day, my mother called my office, leaving a message with my assistant, the tone of her voice clipped and formal, as if she were addressing a customer service rep and not her own daughter. "Tell Amanda her family needs her," she said, "and she's being ridiculous." I realized then that this wasn't just about a forgotten anniversary or a viral home video. This was about years of being overlooked, years of being told to be the bigger person, years of watching my needs and feelings take a back seat to Melissa's endless parade of crises. So I did something that felt both petty and profoundly necessary. I gathered every physical reminder of my parents' love, every dusty birthday card, every mismatched Christmas gift, every photo where I was standing off to the side with a polite smile, and I boxed them all up. Then I took those boxes to the post office and mailed them back to my parents, postage due, so they'd have to pay for the privilege of receiving the past back on their doorstep. Ben watched me from the kitchen, a concerned look on his face, but I didn't explain myself. He wouldn't have understood, not really. To him, family was something that could be mended with enough time and distance. But for me, every item in that box was a weight lifted, a chapter closed, a tiny act of rebellion in a life full of quiet acceptance. I didn't stop there. My parents had always looked forward to my vow renewal, a small but meaningful ceremony Ben and I had planned for our 10th anniversary, a chance to do things right, surrounded by the people we chose, not the ones we felt obligated to include. So I took the invitation list, deleted my parents' names, and sent out a group message to everyone else, a public, unmistakable signal that for once, they weren't welcome at my table. The backlash was immediate and frankly spectacular. My mother called, her voice trembling with rage, threatening everything from disinheritance to public humiliation if I didn't come to my senses. She accused me of destroying the family, of punishing her for loving my sister, of being cruel and vindictive. "You want war?" she said, her voice low and cold. "You got it. Don't come crawling back when you realize you're alone." It was the closest she'd ever come to telling me how she really felt, and it hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for, not because I cared about her approval, but because it confirmed what I'd always suspected, that love in my family was transactional, doled out in small doses to those who played by the rules and withheld from anyone who dared to rewrite them. For a moment, I considered backing down, apologizing, smoothing things over for the sake of peace. But the thought of returning to that old dynamic, of spending another decade pretending to be grateful for scraps, made my skin crawl, so I held my ground. Let the angry texts and emails wash over me like a tide, and waited for the storm to break. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for their approval. I was waiting for them to realize I didn't need it anymore. Of course, it wasn't that simple. The ripple effects were immediate and far-reaching. Old friends started calling, wanting to know what happened, picking sides in a battle I'd hoped to fight alone. Some understood, others didn't, but for once, I didn't feel compelled to explain myself, didn't feel the need to justify my decision to people who'd never truly understood what it meant to be invisible in your own family. Instead, I poured myself another glass of wine, sat on the porch as the sun went down, and listened to the quiet that finally felt like peace. But peace, as I was about to learn, is a tricky thing. It can be shattered in an instant, undone by a single message, a single word spoken in anger. Late that night, Ben came into the living room, phone in hand, a troubled look on his face. "Your dad texted me," he said, his voice soft but steady. "He says you broke this family. Congratulations." There was no anger in his voice, just a kind of weary resignation, as if he'd finally accepted that some wounds don't heal, no matter how much you want them to. I took the phone, stared at the message, and felt nothing, no anger, no regret, just a deep, unshakable certainty that I'd done what needed to be done. And yet, as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd gone too far, if my need for justice had tipped over into something uglier, something I couldn't take back. I'd cut the cord, but the scars would linger, and I had no idea what would grow in the space I'd created. All I knew was that, for better or worse, I was finally in control of my own story, and whatever came next, it would be on my terms. It's funny how, When you finally get the silence you've always secretly wanted, the kind that's thick and total and unbroken by the constant background noise of obligation, you realize that peace is a double-edged sword. It can be comforting and yet unsettling, like sitting in a house that's just a little too quiet after a lifetime spent tuning out everyone else's shouting. The first few days after I'd severed ties with my parents were a study in contrasts. My life at once emptier and somehow more vivid. The colors of my own world suddenly sharper without the static of family expectations humming in my ear. Ben hovered around me, unsure whether to offer comfort or distance, his own loyalty torn between wanting to fix things and respecting the lines I'd drawn, lines that neither of us could quite believe had finally, truly become real. I found myself walking through the house, looking at every photograph on the wall, every relic of a life that had been intertwined with theirs for so long that disentangling my story from theirs felt like peeling off a second skin, painful, necessary, and yet leaving behind a rawness I wasn't prepared for. There were pictures from holidays that, at the time, felt warm and whole, but now, through the lens of everything that had happened, seemed staged and brittle, all of us smiling as if nothing had ever been wrong, as if the entire concept of favoritism was just something invented by bored therapists and angsty teenagers. I tried to tell myself that I didn't care, that I was stronger for having finally said no, but the truth is, the human heart is a stubborn thing. It remembers what it wants to, forgets what it must, and in the end, always circles back to the same aching questions. Did I do the right thing, and is there any way back from here? The rest of the world, of course, kept turning, oblivious to the tectonic shift in my own little universe. Work was a welcome distraction. Emails and deadlines, the comforting routine of problems that could be solved, tasks that, unlike families, had clear beginnings and satisfying endings. My friends, sensing something had changed, reached out in tentative waves, offering invitations to coffee or drinks, unsure whether to probe or let me come to them in my own time. Some were supportive, sharing their own stories of fractured families and long-standing resentments. Others danced around the subject, afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid that acknowledging the rupture might somehow make it permanent. Even my daughter, too young to grasp the full weight of what had happened, sensed the change, asking why Grandma and Grandpa weren't coming to visit anymore, her small voice cutting through my defenses in ways no adult accusation ever could. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a pile of mail, bills, catalogs, the usual detritus of adulthood, I found an envelope addressed in my sister's unmistakable handwriting. For a moment, I considered throwing it out unread, letting her words dissolve into the recycling bin, along with the grocery store flyers and dentist appointment reminders. But curiosity won out, as it always does, and I opened it, bracing myself for whatever fresh guilt or anger Melissa had decided to deliver. Her letter was short, written in a style that tried too hard to sound indifferent, but couldn't quite mask the resentment simmering beneath the surface. She told me that Mom was in the hospital with stress, that Dad hadn't been sleeping, and that, in her words, "This is all your fault. I hope you're happy." There was no plea for reconciliation, no attempt at understanding, just the cold, familiar calculus of blame, a transaction that had always somehow ended up in my account, no matter who wrote the check. I read the letter twice, the words blurring at the edges, and felt a surge of something that was part anger, part grief, and part the old, unkillable urge to fix things, to smooth everything over the way I'd always done. For a brief moment, I considered calling my mother, imagined myself walking into her hospital room, trying to make sense of a lifetime's worth of misunderstanding in one impossible conversation. But then I remembered the last call, her voice sharp and unyielding, her love always conditional, always predicated on my willingness to play the part she'd assigned me. I realized, with a kind of grim clarity, that nothing would ever change as long as I kept returning to the same script, kept offering forgiveness to people who didn't even think they needed it. Still, I went to the hospital. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was some vestigial sense of duty, Or maybe I just needed to see for myself whether the rupture was as final as it felt. The air in the hospital was thick with the scent of disinfectant and resignation, the hallways echoing with the low hum of machines and the muted conversations of people much more hopeful than I was. I stood outside my mother's room, watching through the window as she dozed, my father sitting at her side, eyes fixed on his phone, Melissa leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a line of pure defiance. I hovered there for a few minutes, unsure whether to knock or turn away, my own reflection staring back at me from the glass, older and more tired than I'd ever seen myself. When I finally gathered the nerve to enter, Melissa looked up first, her face a mask of accusation, as if my very presence was a further insult. My father didn't look up at all, his attention fixed on whatever urgent nonsense was playing out on his screen. My mother, roused by the shift in energy, opened her eyes and gave me a look that was part relief, part sorrow, but mostly exhaustion, the look of someone who has fought too many battles and lost most of them. I stood there, awkward and uninvited, and realized that whatever forgiveness I'd come seeking wasn't mine to find. After a moment of heavy silence, I placed the note I'd written on the bedside table, a few lines I'd labored over, hoping for honesty without cruelty. I always hoped you'd fight for me the way you fight for Melissa. Guess I was wrong. No one said a word as I turned and walked out. The only sound the slow, steady beeping of a machine counting out the seconds until I was gone. Outside, the world felt both brighter and infinitely colder, the sun harsh against my skin. The parking lot suddenly much bigger than I remembered. I sat in the car for a long time, letting the engine idle, thinking about all the times I'd tried to earn love by being good, by being quiet, by being the one who never asked for anything. It hit me then that, for all their claims of heartbreak, my family had never really known me, had never really cared to see past the surface. They loved the idea of me, the convenient, reliable Amanda who never rocked the boat, but the reality was too messy, too inconvenient, too unwilling to stay in her assigned place. When I got home, Ben was waiting, his concern etched deep into the lines around his mouth, his arms opening in silent invitation. For a moment, I let myself believe that, in choosing my own happiness, I hadn't destroyed everything, that maybe the life we were building, small, imperfect, honest, was worth whatever it cost to walk away from the people who refused to see me. But the illusion was brief, punctured by the ping of Ben's phone, the new message flashing across the screen like a warning siren. It was from my father, and the words were as cutting as anything he'd ever said. "You broke this family. Congratulations." I stared at the message, feeling the old guilt flare up, hot and insistent, but I refused to let it take root. Instead, I turned to Ben, searching his face for any sign of doubt or resentment, but all I saw was the quiet strength that had always anchored me, the promise that, no matter how loud the world outside became, we'd figure it out together. That night, as we lay in bed, the silence was different, not empty, but full of the things we didn't need to say. The understanding that comes from surviving something you never thought you'd have the courage to do. And yet, as I drifted toward sleep, I couldn't escape the sense that this was only the beginning, that the real reckoning was still ahead. Families, after all, don't just disappear when you close the door. They linger in memory, in habit, in the endless loop of what-ifs and might-have-beens that replay in the quiet moments. I'd set fire to the old script, but the smoke was still thick in my lungs, and I had no idea if the air would ever clear. The only thing I knew for certain was that, for the first time, I was breathing for myself, and whatever came next, it would be on my terms, not theirs. There's a peculiar weight to the days that follow the end of something as fundamental as family, a heaviness that lingers not just in the spaces where conversation used to live, but also in the moments you thought would be bright and full of promise, the occasions you always imagined would be defined by laughter and the easy certainty that you belonged to something bigger than yourself. In those first weeks after I made my break final and irrevocable, I discovered that freedom is not the same as happiness. It is not always relief, and it is certainly not the end of pain. What it is, at least in my experience, is the slow, hard-won permission to build a life on your own terms, even if those terms come with an ache you can't quite name, a constant awareness that your old self still haunts the corners of every decision you make, watching to see if you'll falter or flourish without the safety net of unconditional, if deeply flawed, love. The morning after Ben received my father's message, a message as cold and clinical as any corporate memo, as if love were something that could be revoked with a single bitter sentence, I stood at the window and watched the light spill across the kitchen floor, suddenly aware that my world was both smaller and more honest than it had ever been. There was no illusion left, no possibility that I could ever go back to the way things had been. Not after everything I'd said and done, not after the clarity that had finally settled in my bones like winter frost. And still, as I sipped my coffee, I found myself reaching for my phone, fingers hovering over old photos and numbers, tempted by the comfort of old patterns, of the familiar tug to fix, to explain, to apologize. I didn't call, I didn't text, I didn't give in. Instead, I made a promise to myself, a quiet, stubborn vow that I would see this through, no matter how much it hurt, because I deserved, at least once in my life, to find out who I could be when I wasn't carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. I started small, as anyone would, testing the boundaries of my new life, the way you test ice you're not sure will hold. I hosted a Friendsgiving, inviting only the people who had stayed by my side when things got messy. Old friends from college who never judged, Ben's sister and her partner, a neighbor who always brought homemade pie, and even a few co-workers who had quietly confessed their own complicated family stories in whispered conversations over too much coffee. There were no awkward silences, no performances, no sense that anyone was keeping score. The laughter was real, the food was imperfect, and for the first time in years, I felt something like joy, a fragile, uncertain thing, but real enough to make me wish I'd found the courage to seek it out much sooner. But freedom, I quickly learned, has its own price, and the world does not simply let you walk away without consequence. News of my absence spread faster than I could have imagined, through cousins, old friends, and that unstoppable current of family gossip that seems to have a life of its own. Some people reached out, their messages full of understanding and quiet support, but many more chose sides, drawing lines in the sand, deciding who was right and who was selfish, without ever bothering to ask what really happened. Even Ben's parents, well-meaning as they were, tiptoed around the subject, offering platitudes about forgiveness and second chances, their eyes full of a concern they didn't quite know how to name. I let them talk, let them offer their well-intentioned advice, but inside I knew there was no path back. Not now, not after all the boundaries I'd fought so hard to enforce. Then, one day, as winter settled in and the world seemed quieter, I stumbled across a photo online. A group shot from some family event, everyone smiling, Melissa at the center as always, my parents flanking her with the pride reserved only for the golden child. They had created a new family group chat, someone said, a virtual gathering place where my absence was not just accepted but actively enforced. My name spoken only as a warning of what happens when you refuse to play your part. For a moment, I felt a rush of jealousy, a pang of longing for the ease of belonging, but it passed quickly, replaced by the hard-earned knowledge that sometimes the price of freedom is being replaced, forgotten, and left behind. I tried to keep my focus on what mattered, on Ben, on my daughter, on the fragile network of friends and chosen family who reminded me, every day, that love can be rebuilt, that loyalty is not the sole property of blood and tradition. I poured myself into work, into hobbies I'd let slip, into the daily routines that slowly wove themselves into the fabric of a new kind of happiness. Still, the old wounds didn't heal so much as scar over, leaving me tougher, but not entirely immune to the occasional sting of regret. Late at night, I'd find myself replaying old conversations, wondering if I could have said something different, wondering if any amount of honesty would have changed the outcome, or if my family was always destined to break along these fault lines. As the months slipped by, the tension in our home softened into something gentler, something that didn't demand constant vigilance or apology. Ben and I grew closer, our conversations deeper and more honest than they had ever been when I was stretched thin, playing peacekeeper and prodigal daughter in the same exhausted breath. Our daughter thrived, free from the awkward visits and the sense of competition that had always tinged our family gatherings. I realized, with a kind of bittersweet clarity, that sometimes the greatest act of love you can offer yourself is the willingness to walk away, even when the world insists you should stay. On the day of our vow renewal, a celebration that, even in its simplicity, felt like the most radical thing I'd ever done, I decided on one last act of revenge, though it was less about hurting anyone and more about reclaiming my own narrative. I took a group photo, everyone who mattered to me gathered close, laughter bright in their eyes, no ghosts in the corners, no secrets hidden behind forced smiles. I printed the photo, framed it in the kind of heavy, ornate frame my mother always favored, and mailed it to my parents with a note that read, "Thanks for teaching me how to choose my own family." And now, as I sit here telling you this story, I find myself circling back to the same questions I began with, the same doubts, the same fears, the same aching hope that maybe there was another way. Some version of this life where love wasn't a competition and forgiveness wasn't a weapon. Did I do the right thing? I'm not even sure anymore. Some nights I lie awake and count the losses, tally up the regrets, and wonder if the price I paid was worth it. Other days I catch myself laughing with Ben, holding my daughter close, building memories that belong only to us. And I know, at least for now, that I finally feel seen, or maybe for the first time, I simply see myself. Maybe one day, my parents will reach out. Maybe Melissa will find it in her heart to see me as more than the villain in her own carefully curated narrative. Or maybe not.